And then for American rum, I think there's a couple really interesting things I've seen develop over the last 15 years in American rum, as far as like what is American rum, right? And it's still really new. I know there's a lot of moves to like, have a GI or whatever, but I think we also need to be real about like, we don't have the uninterrupted, legacy that other producers have. And like, we're still kind of finding our way. And it doesn't mean we can't, work on and be proud of like who we are and our message about who we are. But like, we are not desperate for legal protections the way that Jamaica is desperately trying to protect their GI. The Barbados GI that was proposed previously and approved by all of the distilleries now has one opposition and cannot get passed, and they cannot protect their legacy. Like, we're in a very different position. And so for me, like, American rum always tends to have really high flavor definition. The flavors on the palate are very crisp. If you get like a lemon or a limey flavor, there's a crisp edge to that flavor. Whereas in the Caribbean, because of a lot of the terroir influences, the flavor definition is a lot more broad. It's sort of like all the flavors are kind of melding into each other and they kind of transfer in and out of each other. And ours tend to be a little bit harder flavor definition. This has to do with, I mentioned the diurnal shift during fermentation, the yeast we tend to use. Like for me, if I'm blind tasting a French champagne or something like Roeder Estate from Anderson Valley, which seems very French, I can tell them apart because of the fermentation esters. And it's just like there's a fruitier fermentation ester in the California one. So we have that. We have these fermentation esters are very prominent. I think that comes a lot from the temperature we ferment at being very different, that diurnal shift being very different, with climate and conditions in which we distill being very different. We have a really linear structure on the palate. Like flavors can drive really intensely and crisply down the palate. It has a crispness and a brightness to it that I really enjoy. Whereas again, the Caribbean rums can be, as a generalization, obviously each one is a little bit different. Could be like Worthy Park, super inland. They have a very different aging climate than other Jamaican producers. But the generalization in America, it's linear, and as a generalization, a lot more of the further southern distilleries in the Caribbean, they have like a broader, rounder, weightier kind of horizontal kind of feel. And yeah, the preservation of the flavor of the base material because of the yeast we select and the temperatures we ferment at, and often the pHs we ferment at, they can be preserve that base material flavor. Obviously, you see this in agricole as well, which a lot of them are high altitude or inland. They have a sort of a similar kind of influence, but molasses wise, like the character of the grade of the molasses really comes through. And then we source a lot of wet oak. So when we get our oak barrels, they're still wet inside, which gives a very plush. It's almost like in white wine when you ferment in barrel versus when you age in barrel. The aging in barrel would be going into a dry cask, and then the fermenting in barrel would be going into a wet cask. That same kind of plush integration of the oak from those wet barrels, I think, is really important as well. So yeah, there's just some characteristics that are, if you're tasting for, what is the American rum character, I think those show up.
I think it's so interesting to talk about these characteristics that you notice in sort of like in relief of this idea of this what I would call right now a pie in the sky idea of like setting up a geographic indication, right? Because kind of same, like they kind of do blend into one another in that, like, well, the process-based rules of the geographic indication lead to these characteristics that you tend to find, right? So they are connected, but it's interesting how like you don't need one for the other. Like right now, it totally makes sense that you're sort of like just picking out these things that you've noticed over the last, dozen years or so of the things that you've just tended to notice in your experience tasting and creating all these different rums. And the preservation of the fermentation substrate, like the fidelity of the input, is an interesting note, because I recently had a chance to do a rum blending project, and that was the thing that blew me away the most, because a number of the potential blend components that we were tasting, the only difference, there would be same producer, and this producer would say, yeah, so the difference between sample number 1, sample number 2, and sample number 3 is that sample number 1 was made this way and using this. Number 2 is made the same way, but using this. And number 3 was made the same way, but using half this and half that, right? Half of A and half of B. And I was blown away when having the opportunity to taste in that sort of split test fashion, the AB, almost like the AB and then the A plus B, half A, half B, just the massive differences that had just by changing the fermentation substrate. And it seems like what you're saying is that in certain traditions and in certain places with different climates and inputs, you're not going to see that big of a difference that you as compared to what you would see in the US.
Yeah, I think it'll show up in all of them, right? If you were to use a different grade in Trinidad, it would show up. It would affect the spirit. It would have an impact on the spirit. It would change the character, and it would be a part of the whole and lifting up the whole. But I feel like in especially continental North American spirits, the like literal flavor, because we have a we often, right? We have to make generalizations. Often have average cooler temperatures. She's going to have average cooler fermentations. The dissolved gases will dissolve more into the liquid, and that can convert to different acids, and that can create different aromas. I feel like there is a literal element of the base material that really comes to the top, where it's more integrated in the Caribbean spirits. It's more a part of the whole. Like I said, there's less flavor definition. It's more of the broad whole and the sort of like if you imagine making like a berry compote as opposed to like eating 5 different berries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, like the quality of sourcing is really important, because those on average cooler temps, those on average higher dissolved gases, those on higher average diurnal chefs are going to bring some of those aromas and flavors to the top, the literal base material, as opposed to what the base material transforms into. So it's going to impact both, but like the flavor of the base material, I feel like you're like, this tastes like grade B. This tastes like ashy grade C, you know? Yeah.
Well, and so I think what you're pointing out is really, it makes me think of is, let's say I were launching a rum brand in the US. One of the choices that you make as a business owner / distiller is you pick what your fermentation / distillation substrate is going to be, right? What kind of sugar based thing are you going to make your rum out of? And I think a lot of folks who are just starting up have financial constraints / logistical constraints that push them toward one thing or another. And it seems like knowing what you just described, which is something that wasn't anywhere near the top of my consciousness until just now when we were speaking about it, even though I'd had this literal tasting experience about a month ago, it would seem to me that like one of the traps, almost the potential places where you can make a decision that paints you almost into a corner that you didn't realize you were painting yourself into, is that selection choice.
Yeah.
And so I think it just seems like one of those decision points that is, especially in North America, disproportionately important. And it's not something that I hear a lot of people talking about. A lot of people want to launch a rum brand for whatever reason they want to launch a rum brand, but it seems like that is a really crucial point in the process.
1,000%. And this is all part of my like building a relationship to rum. You can't just read like a book written by a non-Caribbean person and be like, oh, I know how to make rum now. You really have to build a relationship to the spirit to get to know the ins and outs and the nuances and the people who really know.